Welcome, engineers. My name's Travis IQ, and I've got 7 days to pass Pentest Plus, a daily vlog on how I'm doing it, what I'm doing, and what approaches I'm taking. Let's go! First and foremost, 7 days. That doesn't sound like very much, does it? Well, you should probably know that I do have a background in this stuff, right? I hold a bunch of CompTIA certs already: Security Plus, Cloud Plus, Net Plus, CYSA Plus, the CEH, CND from EC Council, CCNA certs, all types of things. So I do this very often, first and foremost. I do have a background in the material. So 7 days, while it does sound pretty ridiculous, probably isn't that bad, actually. The thing that I wanted to document was kind of my process. And so what I'm going to start here on day one is actually taking some practice exams from a representative practice exam bank and then determining what I think my deficiencies are, or what I think are some weird quirks about this particular exam in relation to pen testing and some of the fundamentals of pen testing that maybe I don't have. And then I'm going to go back through and review some of the course material that I already have. That being said, you should also know that I have taken a look at the course material already, and I have a pretty thorough understanding of the bulk of that material already. So I looked at the material, decided, hey, this is a test that should be relatively easy to pass. Given my particular skill set, I've already at least determined what I think should be my deficiencies and my strengths. And now I'm going to confirm that with a test bank, a representative test bank, going through it myself, and then supplementing that with some learning. And so what you're going to see here over the next 5 to 7 days before I take the exam, and then after I take the exam, a little bit of review, is what that process looks like, what I think. I'll give you my opinion on what my deficiencies are and what I'm trying to at least brush up on in terms of like an exam knowledge base, and what I think are some strengths that I'm probably not going to talk about. So let's talk about my process here on day one, right? What you're seeing at the start is me, again, what I said I was doing, which is taking some practice questions. I like to personally, after having reviewed the material, and again, having kind of a background in this, I don't necessarily have to review the material quite as thoroughly as maybe someone who is trying to break into the space or using the cert for a different reason. I'm passing the cert specifically to teach to the exam objectives at a later date. And so for me, right, the best thing to do is to get a feel for what the exam questions actually look like. And so I'm doing that here. I'm running through some exam questions. I'm taking some notes. I'm looking up terms that I'm familiar with that I am or am not familiar with, depending upon the nature of the question. And I'm verifying some terms that I think I'm familiar with that I may not be. I'll give you a good example. WMIC, Windows Management Instrumentation Command Line. This is something that I'm moderately familiar with, and I understand its utility, but I don't necessarily use this command line utility very often. And so if there's a question related to, let's say, Windows command line utilities, and I see some tick qualifiers that I'm not necessarily sure what this subqualifier or what this pipe means, then what I'll do in this situation, especially here on day one, where I'm not considering myself test ready, is I'll go through these and I'll actually look up what these things mean, and I'll see if they're relevant to the question or not. If they're not relevant to the question, I'll discard them and go with the other things that I know. If they are relevant, right, so it's a term that maybe I didn't know but was relevant to the exam set, then I'll try and commit that to memory. Maybe I'll take some notes, and you'll see me taking some notes here at some point as well. You'll also notice personally, right, that I do different things when I'm testing. I like to be fiddling or doing things that are maybe making me a little bit more comfortable. I've got my dogs coming in and out. I'm not the type of person who's going to sit down and take an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours worth of exam questions on my own outside of the actual test. Now, again, I don't mind that in a defined test infrastructure, but for myself and my study habits, I find that I retain these things a little bit better if I'm giving myself a moderate time frame to try and retain this information, and then doing some other activities intermittently, either if it's taking a look at the news or doing something like this. So again, why are we talking about this and not some of the other more technical stuff? The reason is because this is day one, and so on day one, the motivation is try and get yourself through the material, try and get yourself accustomed to this type of test, try and get yourself accustomed to the format that maybe a Pentest Plus, for example, would have versus, let's say, an easier exam like a Network Plus, where it's going to be a lot more physical connector types, and it's going to be a lot more specs and standards. That's not what this type of test is. The more technical you get with these exams, when you start getting into Pentest Plus or more technical Cisco exams, or other technical exams related to security and penetration testing and things like this is it's going to be a lot more subjective. And so that's one of the things that I also wanted to point out, and probably some of the notes that I'm making here are related to the subjectiveness of the question pool. What's the best thing you should do? When should you notify a client? What should dictate your next move in this situation? What's the best tool to do this thing? You notice I'm using terms like best, most likely, the resulting output, or these types of things from less specific tool sets, or from a scan of a network that's not specified fully. So these are, in my opinion, more subjective questions. It makes it a little bit more of a frustrating test. It makes it a little bit more important that you have a really strong fundamental understanding and even a practical understanding of what's going on, because if you don't, then you're not even going to be able to come close to making these assertions. Now, as we get towards the end of my studying here, I will talk to you a little bit about some of the things that I found interesting and some of my deficiencies, like I said I was going to do. So I've already talked to you about one of my deficiencies would be some of the Windows command line utilities and some of the utilities for exploitation of Windows machines. The reason for this, I believe, is most of my exploitation has been in Linux environments, and I tend to even lean towards Linux boxes when I'm doing exploitation games and things like this, hack the box and whatnot, probably because I'm leaning on what my experience is. And as a result, what have I done? I've kind of pigeonholed myself into more Linux-based utilities and less Windows-based utilities. And so what I'm noticing for myself is that these Windows command line utilities and other Windows PowerShell utilities and things like this are not as familiar to me. You have to be really honest with yourself when you're taking these types of things and say, hey, this is a deficiency for me, even though I think I should know these better than I do. Another one that I found was interesting was some discussions of the attack frameworks. And these are things that I'm familiar with, and I actually like them, but I'm not as familiar with them in a test situation. And so things like the OWASP attack, the OWASP top 10, the MITRE attack framework, some of these other frameworks by Lockheed Martin and whatnot, right? I'm familiar with them and I find them interesting, but I need a more in-depth understanding of some of these frameworks to be able to more effectively answer the questions. And again, I probably don't have as much experience with those utilities because I'm leaning more towards exploitation and Linux exploitation and not necessarily thinking about the exploitation frameworks and techniques and practices, TTPs, right? So I should probably familiarize myself with these. I also found it particularly annoying. I want to reiterate the best answer or the most likely or the best next step or these types of things. While I do think that they are extremely useful, I'm not necessarily sure that I prefer that exam infrastructure, and I also don't think that I don't necessarily think it's the best way to test it. But you should prepare. I should prepare myself for the representative questions that I have seen at least, and hope that that's representative of the exam. So the first few questions from my question pool were a very interesting experience, and I thought I'd update you. So each of these questions were showing the logs or results of traffic intercept or some data pulled off of a server, and they were showing base64 encoded information and asking some questions about it. And so what I first saw, and this is something that you may experience when you take a real exam or a practice exam set, right, is large swaths of base64 encoded information. And I expected this exam to be a combination of those things as well as some operational information that you might need to know about how to transparently communicate with the client, how to set up rules of engagement, what would constitute emergencies and things like this. Didn't see any of that information, and I saw a lot of base64 encoded traffic analysis. Now this is something that I'm moderately familiar with, or actually pretty familiar with, but not something that I expected to see back to back questions. I have to tell you, I was like, whoa, is this just going to be an extremely technical exam that might actually take me a little bit longer to prep for? And so, my heart dropped a little bit. I was like, whoa, this is some really intense stuff. And as I proceeded through the question pool, just like you may do as you're either taking the exam or taking some practice exams or looking through the material, no matter what direction you kind of take to do your prep, you might think the same thing. And I would encourage you to do what I did. Take a deep breath, look through the rest of the material, continue on, and go, okay, is this something I'm more familiar with? Is this what I expected? And not take a small subset of what you've been given and extrapolate in your own mind, because that's when you get in trouble. And that's what your brain wants to do. So I didn't do that. I continued on. I said, yes, this is the question pool, and this is the content that I was familiar with. Some of this technical stuff I find enjoyable anyways, but if you had to do that at length, right, over the course of 80, 90, 100 exam questions, that would be a little scary, and even for myself, I'd be like, whoa, this is a lot more intense than I had initially thought that it would be. And in fact, it wasn't like that. So there you go. We're continuing on, we're prepping, and we're going to fill in the holes and gaps as we see them.